Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me for this talk. It's a great pleasure to be speaking at BAAL. In terms of broadening horizons, for some of you, possibly forensic linguistics is already at the horizon of applied linguistics. For others, maybe you're forensic linguists. I see one or two faces in the audience of those I recognise. And to all of you, thank you very much for inviting me. What I want to talk about today is that there is a core understanding of forensic linguistics, and some of the work we've been doing is extending that, is moving away from the central understanding of forensic linguistics. And I think we do that in these three different ways. We are moving the applications in applied linguistics. We are finding new applications of linguistics in the world of forensic linguistics. We are speaking to new audiences. So the main audiences, the main beneficiaries of forensic linguistics, you might think are lawyers and maybe police. We're now speaking with security services and governments, and also in a different area, commercial organisations interested in security and forensic linguistics. And one of the things I think is really important is because forensic linguists ask slightly different questions from other areas of applied linguistics, we have a slightly different view on theories, and in particular I'm going to talk about theories of identity, which is something that really interests me. So broadening the horizons can cover all these three areas, and I hope to demonstrate that in this talk. So let's make sure, okay. So this is what I think is sort of typical forensic linguistics, or I'm going to do that. No, I don't have to keep on looking over the shoulder, just check the slides are all right. So this is the core of forensic linguistics. I think there's three main areas that we teach our students. If you do, there's a couple of MAs in the country in forensic linguistics, and if you do an MA in forensic linguistics, you will cover these areas. You will cover language and the law. So typically the language of statutes and contracts, the language of the written law. Why is the written law hard to understand, hard to read? Why do efforts at plain language campaigns in written law often fail, or lawyers complain about them? Okay, so there's a whole area of study and of interest there. There is the study of spoken interaction in legal contexts. In the criminal context, from the point of arrest, the communication of rights, the police caution, through to the language of the police interview or the police interrogation, through to the language of the courtroom. Why do expert witnesses get longer turns than ordinary witnesses? Yeah, there's a lot of work in linguistics on language and power. And in the courtroom, there's really explicit rules about who gets to speak and when. So there's a whole lot of linguistic work we can do in that area. And then there's finally the stuff that I tend to do, which I'd call investigative forensic linguistics, which sometimes is called language as evidence or forensic text analysis. And this is taking linguistic analysis to court. So you're appearing as an expert witness in the courtroom, providing evidence of a linguistic nature. Most typically, or the most stereotypical form of this, is evidence of authorship. Who wrote a particular text? Someone sent me a threatening communication, and can I identify who that person is? And there's two main areas in forensic authorship analysis. There's more areas than that. Okay, but there's two main areas. One we'd call comparative authorship analysis, which is where, so someone sent this threatening communication to me, and I kind of know who they are, and I convince the police that I know who they are, and they obtain through a warrant some known writings of that person. So you've got some queried or anonymous writing, you've got a known writing, and you do what we call a comparative authorship analysis. Yeah, and so as an expert witness, I'll go in court and say that this writing is distinctive in this way, and it is consistent with the known writings. And so that can lead a jury to identify the writer as the suspect. So there's comparative authorship analysis, which is quite a typical task. So I get asked to do that kind of task 20 or 30 times a year by police forces and others, okay? And then there is another task which we'd refer to as sociolinguistic profiling, which is a task where there's no suspect. And quite often these are online anonymous writers, where you're being asked questions like, or you're trying to say, what sort of person wrote this text? Okay? Can we say whether they're a man or a woman? Are they a native speaker of English? If they're a non-native speaker of English, what other languages are influencing their English? Yeah? Are they a British English speaker, or an American or Australian or a Canadian English speaker? Yeah? So you're building up a sociolinguistic profile, a kind of pen picture of the writer of an anonymous text. Okay, so these are the two main tasks. So you've got a core idea of what forensic linguists do through their activities and what they study through this core task. And one of the things that I think is interesting is to not think of forensic linguistics as a list of tasks or a list of questions or a list of areas of study, but as what's the purpose of forensic linguistics? So you can move out to a more functional definition of forensic linguistics, and the definition of forensic linguistics I tend to abide by is this one. So forensic linguistics is an attempt to improve the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. So that's not telling you what forensic linguists do, that tells you what forensic linguistics is for, what's its purpose, what its function is. A move from the structural to the functional should appeal to linguists, I think. Yeah? This is a way of saying that we can get involved in new areas, we can ask new questions that sort of answer this question. This is the means by which we broaden our horizons. And it also leads to a critical linguistics. Okay? We're trying to improve the delivery of justice. That's a critical stance that we take. It's not a merely descriptive stance. So if we go through those different areas, why does changing the language of the written law improve the delivery of justice? Well, if a criminal code applies to all citizens, surely it should be understandable by those citizens. That helps improve the delivery of justice. If we show that the standard police caution isn't understood by different populations in society, improving the delivery of the police caution improves the delivery of justice. It's important. And in doing the linguistic casework, you're improving the delivery of justice in individual cases by providing evidence that the courts can use to come to their just decisions. Okay? So trying to think in that broader scope gives you room to broaden the horizons of forensic linguistics. And this takes you into areas that you might not have considered. Okay? So it takes you away sometimes from evidential forensic linguistics, from doing language analyses where you know you are preparing a report that will take you into a courtroom, into other areas where you're trying to help with the delivery of justice. And the principal area I'm talking about is that of investigation. Okay? And my work has taken me from the evidential into the investigative. So I have worked alongside police teams, police intelligence units, trying to operate against some really serious offenders in online dark web communities. So the word dark web is used by the media. It's really a media term. It's not an academic term. What it refers to is a really heavily encrypted part of the internet, where traditional computer forensics can break down, so you can't identify people easily. Okay? So there's fora, there's marketplaces, a bit like eBay, yeah? There's communities living off the edge of society in this area of the internet that anyone can access. It's quite hard to get to, but not very hard to get to. And everyone is strongly anonymous. But even in those areas, people are interacting, and they're interacting mostly through textual communication. Okay? So in these dark web worlds, how can forensic linguistics help improve the delivery of justice? Okay? And it's an ethical question, because in certain regimes, dissident groups use the dark web. Yeah? But in more open societies, that dark web is used principally by criminal groups, maybe online paedophiles, online people traffickers, online terrorist groups, yeah, all trying to create very real harms in the real world. That's a dangerous term for a linguist to use, isn't it? In our everyday world, yeah? So improving the delivery of justice can mean involving yourself in these investigations, but it's an ethically tricky thing that you're trying to do sometimes. And it's important to bear this in mind. So, talking about these dark web operations, sorry, let me just go back a bit. So I've talked about this a bit already. We've got the strong encryption, which can defeat computer forensic techniques. And also there's an issue of volume and prioritization. So if you think about the policing task, okay, do you want the police to go after and spend... The policing task is always done in the context of limited resources. There's only so many police officers, there's only so much money. Yeah? So do they get a big number of less serious, easy to catch, easy to prosecute offenders? Or do you want them to get the small number of really hard to catch offenders? Or some balance between the two. So there's a prioritization question. And what we're talking about in dark web operations is the really hard to catch offenders. And they will put enormous amounts of money into trying to track down the most serious offenders in these communities. Okay? And there's different operational contexts that they work in. So I am going to be talking about CSEA, stands for Child Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. This is where a lot of my work is. I'm going to be talking about this context. I'm not going to show you anything very disturbing, but this is the context in which I work and I will be talking about this. So it's good to get that out there up front. But also things like terrorism and organised crime and people trafficking and gun sales and things like that. This all occurs in these dark web communities. And here, hopefully that will... No, that's not working. So on the right there, we've got the de-anonymization tasks by linguists and psychologists. And these are the standard tasks of forensic linguistics. We will do the sociolinguistic profiling of dark web offenders to help the police find their, or describe or influence their search for offenders. And if they've caught someone and they've served a warrant and they've seized their computer, then we might do a comparative authorship analysis to assist with their conviction. But in terms of broadening the horizons, we can turn these skills into two new tasks. So with sociolinguistic profiling, we can help undercover police officers adopt the right language so that they can cleanly infiltrate an online group. One of the things I've been writing about recently is to what extent these online communities can be considered communities of practice. Yeah? So if you have an online linguistics, academic linguistics community, it's very easy to consider that a community of practice because there's open exchange of ideas and training and so on. These communities are what the psychologists refer to as low trust communities. So everyone there in an online paedophile community thinks everyone else is an undercover cop. Yeah? And there are undercover cops in those communities. So they're not communities which are cooperative in the normal sense. So do these count as communities of practice? Okay? Or can they partially count? It makes you ask the questions about, well, so Wagner and others set out criteria for what counts as a community of practice. Do we need to broaden the horizon to include these communities, or are they easily caught? These online, anonymous, low-trust communities easily caught by those definitions. So there's real questions there. But what we do know is that different communities adopt different or grow into using different language strategies, different language features. So if you're an undercover police officer and you're trying to infiltrate a community, you have to understand the language, the interactional patterns of that community to do so. Yeah, so we can turn our understanding of profiling on its head a bit and say, we'll profile this community, we'll say that this community uses language in this way. We can sometimes identify that someone has been a member of that community because they use that language in a similar way. And then we can help a police officer insert themselves into that community. Okay, so it's creating a new online identity. This is, in the jargon, is referred to as legend building. And so we are helping with linguistic legend building to enable a police officer to be accepted by that online community. The second thing we do in comparative authorship analysis is we're identifying the language of an individual. So some theorists refer to the idiolect. That carries quite a lot of baggage for me. I like to speak about the linguistic persona or the linguistic individual. Okay? So sometimes the police officers will be able to arrest an important member of these communities. And with the right legal authorities, they can be given permission to replace that person in the online space and to continue those conversations that person has been having as an investigative strategy. So these are low trust communities. So how do you take over someone's conversation without anyone noticing the joins? Okay? In a low trust environment. What you need to do is do an authorship analysis to very minutely describe how that person speaks. Okay? Or types in the online thing. So this is all about language and identity at a very detailed level. Someone's going to say, you're not sounding right, you're not sounding the same, something's up. Yeah? And if you get the language wrong. So we're broadening the tasks of forensic linguistics in these directions. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. I'm going to give you some examples of some research we've been doing in this area and how to achieve linguistic identity disguise for these two tasks. But I'm going to start off with the core task. I'm struggling with this. No. Sorry, I've got to... Okay. And I'm going to talk about comparative authorship analysis, and this is a case where the family is really happy for me to talk about forensic linguistics. We helped with the prosecution in a murder case where Amanda Burks was murdered in 2009. And the family say, yes, please use this as an example to help spread the word about what forensic linguistics can do and use it in training to help forensic linguistics make a greater contribution. So if you've heard me talk about this case before, it's one of the cases where I talk about it a lot because we've got that kind of broad permission of the family to do so. So Amanda died in a house fire in her house in Stoke in 2009. And very quickly, the police were suspicious of the husband, Christopher Burks. Okay? There was grounds for those suspicion. There was forensic evidence that suggested that it wasn't an accidental death. And there was evidence of timing, which was important because Christopher Burks had an alibi for the evening. She died about 11 o'clock in the evening. The fire was about 11 o'clock in the evening, sorry. And when the fire brigade were called, she was tucked up in bed and was burned and was dead. But there was two evidence of timing. So there was a domestic burglar alarm in the property. And Christopher Burks' story was Amanda had been running their joint business together, and she was phoning out to various teams that they ran installing satellite TV aerials in the area. And so she was around the house. And the domestic burglar alarm showed there were no movements in the house during the day where she was meant to be there. And second, there was evidence from her phone. We never recovered either Amanda's phone or Christopher Burke's phone, but we did, what the police did is they went round and knocked on doors on all the families and friends and work colleagues and so on, and collected all the received messages from Amanda Burks and Christopher Burks over about a 3 or 4 month period prior to the fire. So we have this data from their phones that they had sent to the recipients of these messages, and we had about 200 messages from each of them. And what that showed is that Amanda was sending messages till about 8 in the evening, and she died about 10 to 11 in the evening. Okay, so, and Christopher Burks was down the pub from about 6 in the evening through at about 11 o'clock. Yeah, so he had an alibi. Yeah, it couldn't have been him because Amanda was sending messages from her phone. So our comparative authorship analysis was this set of later messages, yeah? First of all, is there a break in the style? You'll get a chain of messages throughout the day and the previous days. Is there a shift in the style? Yeah? And then if there's a shift in the style, that might indicate that someone else is now texting from Amanda's phone. Yeah? And if you've got that shift in the style, do this later set of messages, if they're inconsistent with Amanda's previous texting style, are they in fact consistent with Christopher Burks' previous texting style? That's the comparative authorship analysis question. Who sent the messages that provided the alibi from Amanda's phone? Okay. And we can do a very simple vocabulary analysis. You don't have to read this chart, okay? But it's a little bit old now, so the texting features of this language are a little bit old. Down the left-hand side here, you see some language features. I can't use the laser pointer here, but if you look down to the second grey box, for example, the top line there says with, W-I-V for the word with. Yeah? And if you read along, what you see is that was only ever used by Christopher Birks. That last column says it's 100, second to last column says it's 100% Christopher Birks uses that, and never used by Amanda Birks in the known text, the text from 3 months before. Okay? And that contrasts with the use of W for with, which is 2 lines down, yeah, where Christopher Birks uses that form some of the time, so he's not wholly consistent in how he spells with. Yeah, but Amanda Birks uses it too, and it's predominantly Amanda Birks. Yeah, so you can do a really straightforward count of vocabulary analysis. And you can turn that into a visualization for the jury, which looks a bit like this. Okay, so the texting features, which are predominantly Amanda Stahler in blue and predominantly Christopher Stahler in red. And this is from Christopher's phone on the day before. Yeah, so what you see there is that most of the messages have Christopher Birks features. That when is one of these proportionate features, sometimes majority used by Amanda Birks, but sometimes used by Christopher Birks. Yeah? So you can see that's what you would expect. This is the day before the fire, Christopher Birks' phone, it's mostly Christopher Birks features. From Amanda Birks' phone, the day before the fire, you get mostly the blue features, which is Amanda Birks. Yeah? So this is, then we get to the day of the fire. Okay, oh, so I've done 2 now. On the day of the fire, from Amanda Birks' phone, yeah, the first red feature we get there is at 11:39. Yeah, that for spelling. Yeah, 11:39 in the morning, and Amanda Birks died in the fire at 10 to 11 in the evening. Okay, now that previously has only been used by Christopher Birks. So you put that to a jury and say there's a single word in a text message which kind of suggests it might be Christopher Birks. That's clearly not enough to convict anyone on. That's not beyond reasonable doubt. But after about 12:30, what you get is the messages from Amanda's phone all show Christopher Birks features. And from that time forward, what this evidence shows is the text messages in these disputed messages are consistent with the previous texting style of Christopher Birks and inconsistent with the previous texting style of Amanda Birks. Yeah, all the way through the day until late in the evening. Okay, so that is the classic task of forensic linguistics. We take that evidence to court, we prepare a report, you prepare to be cross-examined, everyone thinks it's really convincing and will convince the jury, and so on the morning of the trial, Christopher Birks pleads guilty to the murder of his wife, and he's now serving life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 19 years. Okay, so that's what you're expecting me to do as a forensic linguist. Okay. Think about this in terms of the extension task, the identity assumption task of becoming someone else online. Christopher Birks had tried to do an identity assumption of Amanda Birks, and forensic linguistics, this kind of quite crude vocabulary analysis, was able to show that there was something wrong. He wasn't very good at it. Excuse me. Oh, I'm going to abandon the clicker. It's more trouble than it's worth. So he failed in his identity assumption. Okay. There was sufficient forensic evidence just to analyse his language at the structural level of vocabulary, punctuation and spelling to show that there was an inconsistency, that there was a break in style. And I, as the suspicious judge, was able to pick that apart and show it, probably in more detail than the layperson. But it's interesting that the person who first said, these messages don't sound like Amanda, was her mother. Yeah, so there's that recognition as well. The task of the forensic linguist wasn't to come in and do a big reveal Sherlock Holmes style. It was to do a close analysis that actually confirmed the mother's story. Okay. A good follow-up question, though, is if Christopher Birks had mastered the vocabulary use, could we have got him in other ways? What else is there in linguistic analysis. Not all linguistics is the analysis of vocabulary and punctuation. It would be pretty boring if that's all that was available in linguistics. Yeah? And so when we're talking about the linguistic persona, we want to go beyond the vocabulary level into other areas. And what's quite interesting is if you do computational authorship analysis and computational forensic linguistics, it's mostly stuck at this level. So, and what we know is the dark web communities are trying to use computational forensic linguists to spot outsiders in their in-groups. Yeah? So we've got to be able to defeat that. You've got a little arms race going on between authorship analysis and identity assumption. Okay, so let's move forward. This is quite old now. It's from Susan Herring's work on online communication, and she breaks down various aspects of language into four main areas of structure, meaning, interaction, and social behaviour. There are other versions of this you can pick and choose, but basically most linguists would agree that there's something like this, some division like this that we'd use, and we picked this one. And there's more work that Susan's done since this one. But what we're talking about is at the structural layer. What we've done is a series of experiments where we've ended up training online undercover police officers in how to do this work, yeah? And so we were able to do some before and after linguistic training studies. Yeah? And they ran a simulation exercise where they had to take on the identity of a 14-year-old girl who was interacting with an abuser, a paedophile. They had to take on that identity in this simulation exercise to arrange a meet-up with the offender so the offender could be arrested. But this is all a simulation exercise, so we can manipulate it experimentally. And this is what we did. So we had a series of experimental tasks looking at this identity assumption. Okay, and what that showed is you've got to get this structural level stuff right. If you don't get the structural level stuff right, then you will be detected. Yeah? Christopher Birks wasn't good at doing identity assumption. It wouldn't have taken a forensic linguist. What I was able to do was kind of structure the analysis and present it in a way that became obvious to the jury. But a person who knew Amanda and knew Amanda's texting style easily recognised that it wasn't Amanda's style. Yeah? So it was a presentational task rather than a really detailed analysis task. So if you don't use the correct words and spellings and punctuation, you will be caught. Okay? Or someone will be in a low trust environment, people will be suspicious enough to abandon that conversation and move on to the next person. And it's relatively easy to train people to do better at this. You'd basically show them the sort of Amanda Birks analysis and teach them how to do it, or write a bit of software that does that, and they can get it right. But what's really interesting in terms of linguistic identity, where the officers struggle, the trainee undercover officers struggle, is they cannot suppress their own linguistic habits as easily as adopting someone else's. And we refer to this as linguistic leakage or leakage of self. Okay, so it's harder to prevent leakage of self. And let me just show you this. So this is from experimental work. We've got the victim, who tends to use quite a lot of clause boundary commas, and the trainee undercover officer writing as themselves in an online conversation who doesn't. Yeah? And but that officer uses a lot of initialisms. Yeah? And the victim doesn't. Yeah? So you've got that contrast. And in that third row, you've got the undercover officer trying to be the victim. And what you end up with is a slightly hybrid identity. They manage to use some clause boundary commas. This is, I think, per 500 words or something like that, the numbers. So the victim uses about 10 or 11 per 500 words. Yeah? The officer manages to use 2 or 3. Yeah? Probably not enough to be very convincing, yeah, at this stage. But they cannot suppress their use of initialisms entirely. So you get this hybrid identity. You get something like the victim's identity, but you also get this leakage of self, which becomes really important. So we can train that, and some people can do better than this after a bit of training, and it's pointed out to them, and we get them to analyse their own linguistic style to work out what the features of their own style are, so that it brings it to conscious level, so that they can then avoid overusing them, and all this stuff that you can do. But also we've written some software to assist them, and I'll show you this here. So the software does a vocabulary analysis, it does other things as well, but you can see the variance up there. So the person that it's analysing, which is Brad in this conversation, uses the various versions of yeah up there. Yes, they spell it Y-E-A-H, Y-H, Y-A-H. They never use the actual, just the Y for yes. Yeah? So different people will work with different ratios of variance, and that will form their linguistic identity. And what we can then do is essentially write a translation algorithm, whereas in the top of those two lines you can write in your own text, and in the bottom line it will produce the language of the person whose identity you're trying to assume. Okay, so you can write an assistance tool for this language disguise task. And the big set of warnings below is the software telling you exactly why it's made the changes it's made. Okay? And that can help. Now, various people have said, oh, can you just completely automate this? And we say, don't go there, because it's not only about the structural layer. This is the easy stuff to do. Okay. So, you've got the structural layer right, you've trained someone, you provide a computer tool to assist them. What do you do next? One of the most difficult things that police officers find to get right, and it's the next most important tell that they're assuming someone's identity rather than it being that person still, is the way they deal with topic introductions. Now, in this domain of child sexual abuse, it's very difficult in an interaction to introduce topics of a sexual nature to a child in a conversation, or even more difficult, as a child who's been entirely groomed who thinks that sexual interaction is normal. Okay? So some of the interactions we look at have children who believe it's entirely normal to be sexualized and have a sexual relationship with an adult. Okay? And these children will introduce sexual topics into an interaction, and so the undercover police officers will have to do the same thing. Okay? If they're not to break the identity disguise. Yeah? And this raises all sorts of really important legal questions about entrapment, which in English law is referred to as agent provocateur, and by documenting that the child has done it through a linguistic documentation of what they've done in the past can actually help against those accusations of entrapment as well, which is quite important, but that's a sort of side benefit. So here's a bit of interaction where you get a sort of relatively mild introduction of a sexual topic. So, hello naughty, hey, you okay? Bit horny, but yeah, you get the bit horny, which is an introduction of a sexual topic. Yeah, and what are you doing about your horniness? And so on. So in this situation, the person who introduced the sexual topic was indeed the child. Okay, it wasn't the adult, and it was the child partly because they had been effectively groomed into thinking this was normal. Okay? So to assume this child's identity, the UCO, the undercover officer, will have to be comfortable in doing the same thing. And it's really hard. It feels to a lot of these officers unnatural to be asked to play the role of a child who will do this. But if they don't get it right, they can't take out that offender as effectively. So it's a really tough ethical dilemma that they are facing. And when we ran the project, it was an ESRC-funded project that we kicked off with this. We worked with some ethicists to work on these very issues and on these very places. They had a third of the money that we got went to a research ethics group at Warwick University who worked through a lot of these issues and provided ethics training material for the undercover officers working in these domains. Okay, so you need to train the officers to develop a crude form of topic analysis or topic introduction, topic denial, and we sort of do this in a cut down form of conversation analysis, but not really. Because we've only got so many hours to train undercover officers, and we could spend 3 years training them in conversation analysis. These are my amusing captures. These are from dark web fora, where I've So someone comes into a particular forum and says, hi, I'm a 14-year-old female. This is in a highly encrypted dark web forum dedicated to online abuse of children, and the immediate response by a member of that forum is, whatever you say, officer. You're obviously law enforcement. So this is the other thing that can happen if you get topic introductions wrong. There's not very many of these, but they're quite fun when you come across them. LEA is law enforcement agent, is American English. Yeah, so you get these kind of examples too. So, topic control finding after the structural features, getting the topic introductions is really crucial. Now, we're not talking about the knowledge of the individual in the identity assumption. We're talking about the method of introduction of the topic, which is different. The police already are finding out as much as they can about what the person knows, what school they go to, what bands they like, what football club they support, or whatever it is. Yeah? It's not about what they know, but it's how you introduce topics. Okay. After that, we get to pragmatics. So this is sort of in Herring's hierarchy. So I'm doing this in the order of importance. If you don't want to get caught, you've got to get the pragmatic stuff right. We all know people who ask loads of questions, or before you start a conversation, tell you everything about themselves. That's a different in pragmatic interaction. Yeah? And we use the really crude 5-level pragmatic categorization between assertives, interrogatives, directives, commissives, and expressives. Okay, we know this isn't sophisticated, but it's shown to be enough. Okay, and what's interesting is even at this level, so this is sort of third order, you've got to get the structural stuff right, the topic stuff right. If you don't get the pragmatic layer right, what our trainers will say is, this sounds wrong, but I can't quite say why. It sort of takes a linguist to get your eye in as to what's going on here. It feels different, even if they can't articulate what the difference is. Okay, so when I say we, I mean we forensic linguists, or possibly most people in this room, can identify identity leakage at this pragmatic level in a way that maybe the layperson, the non-linguist, cannot. Okay, so let me show you an example here. This is a slightly different experiment we did with a really experienced undercover officer. Yeah, and the bit I want you to concentrate on is the underlined bit. So when they're themselves, when they do an expressive, they very often follow it up with an assertive. Yeah, so we've got, this is with a researcher. This is a very benign conversation with a researcher, but we were just playing experimentally with them. So I thought the building was looking quiet. Yeah, lesson stopped at Easter, and that won't start again until October. All right for summer. I was just thinking that I need to get into academia, lol. So I was just thinking that has most of its pragmatic force is expressive, followed up by the assertive, I need to get into academia. That's what this person's habit is. Okay? The identity we asked them to assume was that of Max, yeah, who tended to do this. Just a bare expressive, no follow-up. When this very experienced UCO was being Max, they couldn't help themselves. Yeah? They were really, really good at doing the structural stuff. They got the vocabulary and the punctuation right. They were really, really good at introducing topics in the same way, but at this level, there was still identity leakage. This is fascinating if you're interested in language and identity. It tells you something about how strong our identity patterns are and how we will draw on any level of linguistic resource to present ourselves. Yeah, it's really important. So, how am I doing for time? Identity synthesis, yeah? So we talk about identity analysis, authorship analysis, and we contrast that with identity synthesis, authorship synthesis. Quite hard to say in a big room like this. The most important thing is get the structural layer right, then the topic control, then the pragmatics. But getting any of these things wrong is a tell. Yeah, it will give you away. Computational tools can help with identity assumption, but mostly only at the structural layer. There's clearly corpus linguists will come and tell me at the end that there's quite a lot of work going on pragmatic tagging and corpus linguistics, and I say, yeah, I've seen it, try and get it a bit more accurate, we might be able to do some computational tool. It's really hard, it's not, because what we know in linguistics, generally, I think I'm going to put myself out on a limb here, is that the higher level of functions don't entirely reduce to the structural features. Yeah, its context is important in language understanding, and that's what's hard to encode in computation. Okay, what the graph on the left is a graph of detections. So we had a no preparation condition where, so the dark solid line is the undercover officer trainees. There are other groups, there's student groups and MA forensic linguist groups and things like that. Okay, the dark line is the undercover officers. The no prep condition was where we said you've got to be a 14-year-old girl, but we're not going to show you anything of how she writes in advance. So we gave them a brief linguistic profile. They had to try to be that person. And they were at 73% detection. Then we had a couple of things where they had an over-the-shoulder preparation, where they could look over the shoulder of someone typing to learn their typing style. Yeah? A homework condition, where they went home and could study the transcripts and come in the next day and be that person. Yeah? And finally, the one with our linguistic training, and the 73% drops to about 25% detection of suspicious judges. So this stuff works. Linguistic training of undercover police officers makes them harder to detect in identity assumption tasks. This is my broadening the typical task of a forensic linguist from authorship analysis into authorship synthesis. But it has strong implications for identity theories. Now, every sociolinguist I know is interested in theories of identity. Yeah? And theories of identity are a bit like toothbrushes, in that everyone has their own and nobody likes to use anyone else's. Yeah? So every time I read a student dissertation, they're developing an aspect of a theory of identity. Yeah? And it's hard and there's not a consensus, but there is sort of a consensus that identities are performed, they're not static. People talk about third wave sociolinguistics. Yeah? And most people will recognize something like this, that we have a resource model of identity. Yeah? So we draw on our sociolinguistic history. We draw on the context or genres of an interaction. We draw on the interactants or the communities of practice. And we draw on these resources, and my identity in that conversational moment is unified by the resources I can draw on in that moment. And I create a performance for that moment within that context, within that interaction. Yeah? This is a resource model, so lots of people would subscribe to a version of this. Yeah? Barbara Johnson probably is one of the leading figures, but there are many others too. Yeah? When you're doing this kind of work, what comes to the fore are two aspects of identity theory which are often missed by people with other interests, not non-forensic interests. The one is how we are constrained in identity performance. Right now, stood here today, I cannot perform an identity in Japanese because I do not speak Japanese. Yeah? I can learn Japanese, I can change that, I can accumulate new resources to enable me to perform those identities. Yeah, but right now I can't. Similarly, there are varieties of English I cannot use in my identity performance. I've studied a little bit of multicultural English, street slang. Yeah? So I know some of the words used, but I can't perform convincingly in multicultural London English. I don't have the resources. So my resources go with constraints. Yeah? And I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute. And the other thing, as a forensic linguist, I'm more interested in than just a variationist sociolinguist, is the persistent features of identity. So very often, variationists will talk about how my identities will change from the classroom to the GP consultation to the big lecture theatre like this, yeah? And how I will adapt my identity performance to those different situations. And there's a lot of interest in that, and it's really interesting stuff. As a forensic linguist, I need to find out, well, what stays the same then? What's the persistence of identity? And there is writing on this, but we give that much greater emphasis, the persistence of identity. So, that's what that bit says. So broadening the typical resource theories of identity to focus on individual persistence of identity. And my answer to that question is that we have more dynamic resources, such as the context of the interaction, which we can draw on, and more stable resources, like my own sociolinguistic history, which is a massive, that's a shorthand for all sorts of interesting stuff, yeah? The languages and personal histories I have, yeah? So my sociolinguistic history does change and grow. It's not a static resource, but it's relatively stable. It changes slowly. And my cognitive resources generally change slowly as well, unless I have a brain injury or something. Yeah? So the persistence of identity is explained by these features. Thank you. Yeah? And the other aspect of our theories of identity focuses on the idea that resources are also constraints. And there's sort of two ways in which resources are constraints. The first I've mentioned already, the non-availability of specific resources constrains my identity performances. So if you're, I don't know, 40-year-old male Manchester police officer wants to perform the identity of a 14-year-old girl from the south of England within her particular social milieu, he needs to understand the resources that she is drawing on to perform her identity better. Yeah? And it may be enough to simply study the text, but it's actually better to take a broader view of who she is. Now this is where theories of identity gets interesting. So my identity might be revealed in every text, but every text doesn't reveal the full extent of the linguistic resources I draw on. So you're asking the police officers to look at the text and extrapolate and perform, which is the task undercover police officers do every day on street corners buying drugs or whatever it is they get up to. Yeah? But nevertheless, it's a performance, and it's a really explicit, conscious performance, and that feeds into interesting questions in identity work and linguistics. Yeah. So Buchholz and Hall talk about identities are partially conscious, partially unconscious. Yeah. Language disguise is about being wholly conscious of your identity performance and the resources you're drawing on. Yeah. And also wholly conscious of your own habitual linguistic resources, which you've got to push to one side, otherwise you get leakage. Okay? The other thing is that sometimes the use of one resource will preclude the use of another. So this is a constraint. So an example I've used is that if you are, so we study courtroom language, and one thing that forensic linguists have demonstrated about courtroom language is the difficulty that survivors of sexual assault and rape cases have in performing their identity as a survivor rather than as a victim from the witness stand. They're constrained institutionally. They are only allowed to draw on certain resources. Their legal team will encourage them to draw on resources of victimhood rather than resources of survivorhood. And there's a very real question as to whether that is good for their psychological recovery or whatever. Yeah, that's one of the problems with those kind of interactions in a courtroom. Okay, so institutionally or contextually, sometimes you have to choose one resource rather than another, and this constrains your identity performance in any specific moment. Yeah, so another good example is oppositional varieties. So it used to be in Northern Ireland that people would, teenage boys largely, would get stopped on the street and asked to speak the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then if you say H, yeah, that identifies you as being part of the Catholic community, and if you say H, part of the Protestant community. And that was massively important. It featured in the recent Line of Duty, I think. No, it didn't. It was the other thing that was in Line of Duty. I was waiting for that to come up. Sorry, British TV show. It's very good. And then the code switching between standard and non-standard varieties. So where I've been involved in prosecutions which have involved sort of street gangs speaking mostly multicultural London English, a lot of these individuals can draw on a very standard variety when they're giving evidence from the dock. Yeah, so they're managing their identity very strongly, and choosing that variety, choosing that identity performance precludes a different identity performance. So now, I'm not saying only forensic linguists are interested in this, but forensic linguists are particularly interested in both the persistence of identity, the persistent resources, the stable resources, and also how resources are also constrained. So we talk about a resource constraint model rather than just a resource model. Okay, and that's the talk over. I just want to say, this is the bragging slide at the very end. First, we've got a book out on all this. Me and my Nikki MacLeod, who I work with on this stuff. That's coming out in February. This is the first time we've been able to show the book cover. It just got emailed to me. And secondly, we've just received a large grant at Aston to move our Centre for Forensic Linguistics into this new institute. And what we're trying to do is literally broaden the horizons. So I spoke about the three of the four areas of forensic linguistics, and we've just been going through a recruitment phase where we're recruiting about 13 people, mostly postdocs, but also a professor of language and law and some lecturing posts. And we're just coming to the end of that process now. But so watch this space for broader and broader horizons. So thank you very much.
Tim, I think that goes off to an absolutely splendid start. That was absolutely fascinating and already broadened the horizons for us all. We've got time for a few questions, so I think we've got any questions stored up. Oh, there goes one over there.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. Is there anything when you've taken some of this material, or the people have taken this stuff to court over the last few years, are there any things that defence lawyers tend to attack and say that this is not valid, or what are some of the weaknesses that the court picks up and the defence lawyers try to suggest that this isn't good enough?
Okay, so yes, you always get attacked for whatever you put up, is the answer. If you're appearing in court as a witness, either for the defence or the prosecution, and we do both, and also do evidential reports for civil cases and so on. And it's like an extreme version of, Reviewer 2. You get attacked for whatever you say. But the attacks that are effective are either attacks on method. So it's not enough to say, I'm an expert, believe me. You've got to set out a method that any competent linguist might follow to do an authorship analysis. Some of the work we do is explaining slang terms in the courtroom, multicultural London English or whatever terms in the courtroom. And I did a case where we were trying to say that this amounted to a threat to kill. Yeah? And the use of the term to duppy someone as a threat to kill, to turn someone into a ghost. It comes from Jamaican English, yeah? And so the local police officers knew what it meant, but they're not impartial. So they want an expert who's got doctor or professor in their title to present. But that's not good. That is just battle of the expert stuff. And then you've got some experts in slangs or varieties of English who get up and say, I've studied this for 20 years, yeah? I know what this word means, believe me. That's probably better than the police officers, but it's still not that good. What's best evidence is to create a corpus, or go to a corpus of multicultural London English, and demonstrate the meaning in its context. Yeah, so you do a keyword in context display and show all these people using the word duppy as a verb to mean to kill or to harm someone. So it's about method. Yeah? And if you cannot or have not set out your method, you can and should be roasted. Yeah, and will be roasted probably these days. The other thing is how you express your opinions. Okay, so in the Burt's case, you may not have noticed, but what I said was those disputed messages were inconsistent with the previous texting style of Amanda Burke and consistent with the style of Christopher Burke's. And also there's the idea of they're distinctive from one another, which I showed in those graphs and those visualizations and numbers. I never say in court, and therefore Christopher Burke wrote it, because I don't know that. Yeah, all I can say is what the analysis says. That conclusion is the job of the jury. So I'm going to turn your question around. If I'm critiquing another person's authorship analysis in court, I'll always look at how are they expressing their conclusions, because I don't believe there's anything such as a linguistic fingerprint. Yeah. That you never get an exact match where one person is uniquely identified. It might be down to a small community of people, yeah, but never one person. So I might be able to say that. I might say, not only is this distinctive Amanda Burks and Christopher Burks, but it's distinctive to this small community. I couldn't do that in this particular case, but in another case I might be able to do that. Because you get language features that seem very distinctive, but are in fact locally common. Yeah? And they're the kind of thing you can trip up against if you go for identification. So you've got to be really careful about how you express your conclusions. It's all about method and conclusions, which is about being a good academic, isn't it? It's not different skills. It might be slightly more extreme, but it's not different skills. I think there's a question on the front here. I can't see anyone else with a hand up.
Hi again. Thank you. Very, very fascinating presentation. I have a question on a personal level, if I may. How do you protect your own well-being when dealing with these kinds of tests? Does it affect you? And if so, how do you overcome these?
So it certainly can. And when we're working on the very nasty data of online abuse, we use the police psychologists who work with the police teams to debrief us and work with us. And it's part of our ethical approval process, and rightly so, that we have those researcher protections in place. But even so, and that's about spending long bits of the day reading material that is really very, very nasty. But even in the Burke's case, where the material itself isn't hard to read, it's mundane everyday texting, yeah? The context can be disturbing. So I guess everyone has their own strategies. I think the day it becomes a crossword puzzle rather than a serious rather than something that is weighty, is heavy, because it is heavy, if you view it as just solving a crossword puzzle, I think you should stop. Yeah, it's not that. And I worry sometimes that some of the writings in forensic linguistics, which are case histories, you know, I've done this, I've done that, turns the writer into sort of the hero, the Sherlock Holmes of a story. And I solved this case. And it's almost never like that. You're usually working with a team of people. Yeah, and so you're drawing on the resources of that team for your well-being as well, who are all going through the same stuff with you. But as an outside expert coming in, that you don't want to be part of the police team because you need to be an independent expert. So there are issues there. So my answer is it's complicated, but yes, we're aware of it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right at the top, you're getting exercise today.
Fascinating. My question is regarding cases where victims or suspects speak a language other than English. Mm-hmm. What's the role of forensic linguistics in this situation? I was speaking to a court interpreter the other day, and she seemed to be very demoralised. She said, no matter what I do, there is always an appeal on the grounds that it's the interpreter's fault.
Yes.
So what's the role of forensic linguistics in these cases?
So not everyone in the world speaks English, you know, so we know this, and and there are forensic linguistics units in various places. The forensic linguistics is pretty big in Spanish. It's quite big in German. Yeah, I'm thinking of European languages. The Chinese government's investing heavily in forensic linguistics for reasons that might worry some people. Yeah. So you know, it's not a monolingual study, is the first point. In terms of the interpreter point, so I think the problem, so my colleague Christoph Kradens does quite a lot of work on disputed interpretations, English-Polish mostly, as his name probably gives them away. It depends about how important interpretation difference is. And there's a really difficult appeal court judgment in the UK that the interpreter should be a mere conduit, yeah? And if that was true, interpreters wouldn't be needed. We'd just use Google Translate or something, yeah? If it's just word-for-word interpretation creates a meaningful utterance that carries the same meaning as the source utterance, then, and so there's this misconception about the nature of interpretation, which is the heart of many of those appeals. But there's also, so forensic linguists comment around that and try and inform the courts and the police interviewers, who will use interpreters also, of these difficulties. And Christoph has trained police interviewers in expectations they should have about interpretation. And that's a good role. That's really important. It's harder to sort of train the judges, maybe. Sorry, I was going somewhere. But there's also some very interesting work done by cognitive linguists and sort of neo-Worfians on real language differences between, UEA, Luna Filipovic does this work. And she's got some really nice early studies for her. Things about, so in the courtroom, so a mistranslation where someone was thrown at a bed or on a bed, yeah, which in English-Spanish translation is malleable, yeah? And also she's done work on eyewitness testimony, where she's done language typology work, where one typological difference is around verbs of motion, yeah? So the Romance languages, the Latinate language, tend to have verbs of motion that indicate direction, to exit or to enter, whereas Germanic languages tend to have more words for the nature of the motion. So in English we can stroll, we can stumble, we can run, we can jog. There's lots of verbs of manner. And when she does an eyewitness study where she shows a mock crime of a burglar coming out of a house with a swag bag over their shoulder and disappearing down the street, the Spanish witnesses remember the direction better than the Germanic witnesses, and the Germanic witnesses talk about furtively and things like that. Yeah, talk about the manner. So it has real effects. Yeah, the differences between languages, and there's lots of areas where there's lots of room to insert. To call yourself a forensic linguist by doing those kind of analysis within forensic contexts. And so I'll come back to my broad definition of trying to improve the delivery of justice through a language analysis, bring that to the fore, explain it, show it to the beneficiaries, the courts, the police interviewers, the whoever. And that is an important aspect of what we do. These days they call that the impact agenda. But I think as applied linguists, everything we do is impactful. Yeah, but that's what application means. But there's all sorts of ways you can work across and between and within languages influencing other languages. I mentioned the identification of English influenced by other languages, which can be important too. Okay, thank you.